Educational law and IEP process. I think when I gave the very first presentation, the first question, I saw hands go up and I knew, oh, no one knows what IEP is, and you probably don't know what I.D.E.A is, which are the principles, or I.D.E.A is the actual law, but there are principles throughout that law, and we're going to talk about those quickly today. So the law itself is about, if you get it sent to you, it's about 3,000, 4,000 pages worth of information. However, it is made up of these 6 principles of the law. Those 6 principles include free and appropriate public education, which is often referred to as FAPE, appropriate evaluations, individualized education program or plan, that's the IEP, least restrictive environment, LRE, you'll also hear that thrown around, parental input, super important because a lot of times families do not feel like they're involved in the IEP, and there are many times where I have to say, excuse me, parents have input. So it is actually written as one of the main principles of I.D.E.A. The final one is the procedural safeguards. So what the heck does all of that mean? How do we put this into use? So let's break it down. So free and appropriate public education. The most important thing about that is that free, we all know what that means, right? We all know what public means. We all kind of know what education means. The big word here is appropriate. What the heck does that mean? So what we try to break it down into is that we need to provide the child with whatever it is that they need to be able to access their education. So in this one, the free and appropriate public education, FAPE, is what everybody refers back to. So if we're in a meeting, they're going to say, are we giving them everything that they need to have FAPE? The school system loves for us to say, they need this, and they need this, and their response usually is, yes, but do they really need that to acquire FAPE? And of course, my response is, of course they do. We wouldn't be bringing it up if we didn't think it was necessary. So we try very hard to make this the center of what our IEPs look like. The next one is appropriate evaluations. And I love this picture here because for fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. That's exactly what happens in an IEP meeting. They'll say, oh, well, you have to decide there's going to be one of these evaluations that is necessary to determine which disability the child has. So, of course, this picture, yeah, a monkey's probably not going to have much that they need. The elephant is going to have lots of needs. As we're doing these appropriate evaluations, it's based on what do we think the child actually has? What do we think the disability is that's interfering with them in receiving FAPE? So those evaluations, the appropriateness of those evaluations is determined on what are we trying to find out? And the law kind of lays it out. If, in fact, you think that the child is learning disabled, they very clearly state you have to have a cognitive, you have to have an educational, and guess what? You have to have an observation. The other thing is, if they have a speech and language disorder, guess what evaluation they're going to get? A speech and language evaluation. So some of this kind of falls into place. And the only one that's really interesting is the kids who have a medical diagnosis, because for that also includes ADHD, so other health impaired. So we all know how many medical diagnoses there are. They all fall under that one category. And that means that a doctor has to provide the documentation of that disability. The next one is those appropriate evaluations. As I just mentioned, you have to have very specific evaluations for very specific things. And it's written out into the law as to what it is we need to do in order for them to make that determination. Individualized education plan. So this means that, and the most important word in there is individualized. So oftentimes we will be in a meeting and the school will say things, which they know not to say in front of me, is, well, we don't have that. That's not something we can do. Well, I very nicely tried to say, kind of doesn't matter what you can or can't do. This is based on what this child needs, which is exactly why they will come back to me and say, oh, well, is that really what they need to get FAPE? Yep, that's exactly what we're saying, is that's what they need to obtain FAPE. So these plans will include many pieces. I don't know if you've ever seen an IEP. The more of a disability the child has, the bigger the IEP. I have had IEPs that are 150 pages, and they hand it to the parent 5 days in advance, and they say, we're going to talk about all these things on Friday. And the parent's like, okay. And then we get in the meeting, they'll say, did you have a chance to look at that IEP? And many of them will say, yep. And they have no idea of what they've just read. I can ask them very specific questions on the IEP, and they will say, where do I find that? I have no idea what that is. Even something as easy as, what is the handicapping condition on your IEP, which is actually on the very first page on the right-hand side near the bottom. That's what I tell them, and they're still like, yeah, no, nothing's written in that space. So it's a very complicated document. It's also a contract. It's an interesting contract because we can change it every day. If we go into a meeting and it's not working and we put things in and then it doesn't work out, we can go back the next day and say, yeah, we need to take that out, or we need to redo it. So this is also an interesting one. Least restrictive environment. Restrictions mean the amount of time in special ed and the amount of time with special education students. So if you have a co-taught class, which means there's a regular or a general education teacher and a special education teacher, and there are general education kids and special needs kids in that class, that means that they are not really receiving any pull-out special education time. Even if they receive all special education during that time, they're considered to be in no special education because it's the least restrictive, because you're with peers who are typically developing. So a lot of times we will push to say, no, I don't want it that way. We need to have it where they're either pulled out or pulled aside to get specific things in their IEP. And I can go on a tangent about, and I usually do, about the fact that we don't want kids to be feeling like they are different. So I'm not a major fan of having someone come in and pull a child to the side, unless they're going to do that with all kids. Anybody who's having some difficulty, they can be pulled in and talked to about what we need. If you're just going to come in and take my child aside and pull them to the, now how is that going to make them feel? If I came in and said, Keisha, you're going to come with me and we're going to work over here, everybody else is going to continue doing what they're going to do. Well, that just affects their self-esteem. So I'll try to end there, but trust me, I go on a lot more about that. The next one is parental input. Yay, my favorite. So when I.D.E.A., which we actually have a reauthorization of I.D.E.A. coming up this 2024, when we did 2004, which was the last major change to I.D.E.A., they had these little groups that were all over the country. I never did so much traveling because I would go to each one of these meetings because I wanted to make a point about this very principle of the law. It's important. Schools don't understand it, and we need to make sure that they understand that parents know their kids. And the way I usually say it is, you may be the expert in the education field, they're the expert in the child. And I think I've said that before, and I know my team hears it all the time. So we need to make sure that this happens. There are other things that happen. Schools always decide when the meeting is going to occur. But in COMAR regulations, it actually says that that meeting must be at a mutually agreed upon time and place. So oftentimes they'll say, well, we don't have any available time at that. And I'll say, well, I'm here. So if you want to come here, because it's a mutual place, I would have the time if you want to show up at my place. Oh, no, we can't do that. Well, then I guess you're going to have to move the time. So we really have to watch what they're doing. We also have to make sure that families are heard, because often they will say, oh, well, we'll put that on your page. Yeah, well, I don't really like that so much, because that isn't it is part of the IEP, but it isn't actually a part of what is going to happen day to day. So there's a lot of stuff in here, and this is on the root, so you can look at it whenever you want. But procedural safeguards, I always say, is the easiest one, because all the school has to do is say, here's your procedural safeguards. Could you sign that you have received and understand? That's actually what it says. They hand it to them. The procedural safeguards, although not huge, it has all of this information in there. So you're handing it to them in the meeting. Could you please sign and stating that you've received this and you understand it? So I usually say, just cross out and understand. You just received it. You haven't read it, so you don't have to say that you've understood it. So schools aren't real keen on that, but the reality is they can't be held responsible for all of this information, because you will be in a meeting and they will say, well, didn't you read the procedural safeguard? You signed right here that you understood it. So many times now what they will say is, well, you have your advocate, she can fill you in on things, but we're also here to answer any questions if you would like to utilize our services. So now let's try to put this whole thing together. So we have all of these principles. You know that the law is just enormous, and we at least like families to know those principles. So the IEP process. Now we have the law, but now there's a process that they have to follow that actually is in the law as well. There's the request, there's the initial meeting, there's the order of evaluations, the evaluation results, and then a new IEP. So let's just think about that, because we also have timelines that have to be followed. So the first thing is that someone can call in and say, hey, I need to have this evaluation completed, or I need an IEP. So if a family says, my child needs an IEP, there are many schools who are going to turn around and say, well, you can't just give you an IEP. They know darn right well that the family wants a meeting, not the actual IEP. But they will say, well, we can't give you an IEP. We haven't even talked about an IEP. He's not having that many problems. But if a family says, I want an IEP meeting, they have 30 days to get that meeting on the books. So I will say to families, please make sure you ask for an IEP meeting. And if you're asking for it, which I always like it in writing, first rule of law school, not in writing, didn't happen. So put it in an email. You can call them and ask, but put it in an email. And you can always end with, and I will expect to hear from you within the next 30 days. That gives them a very clear message. She knows the law. She knows that there are timelines that we must follow. So we ask for that. The only people who actually can ask for is a teacher, a school person, anyone in the school can ask for a meeting, or the family. I cannot call and say, this child needs an IEP meeting. So that's why we go to the family. The family will say, oh, could you just write the letter? Sometimes I'll write the letter, send it to them and say, put your name on it, and then send it into the school. The initial meeting, is to talk about, once we get that meeting, hey, we think our child is having some difficulty within school. Okay, they're having difficulty, so what do we need to do? Where do you think they're having the difficulties? So what they usually will say is, well, what disability do you think your child has? Well, you're a parent. All you know is your child is struggling. So I usually say, just put it out there. This is what's happening at home. This is why I think my child is struggling. This is why I think they need help in the classroom. And then if we're in there, we're going to come up with those diagnoses. I mean, I will throw them all in there if I need to, but they want to know, what tests do we need to do? So a lot of times I'll say, well, we definitely need a cognitive and we definitely need an educational evaluation. Do we need speech and language? Maybe. Do we need occupational therapy? Well, if he's having trouble writing or using fine motor, then yes. Do we need physical therapy? That means he's having difficulty with gross motor skills or core. And if a family is saying, well, He can't sit up straight for more than 10 minutes. That's a core problem. So we're going to ask for physical therapy. Once those are determined that, yes, we need it. Now, you heard in the beginning, when you ask for the meeting, 30 days they have to assign it. So let's just say we walk in, we're the first week of school, we ask for an IEP meeting, now they have it 30 days later. So now we're in October. If it's an initial meeting, an initial evaluation, they have 60 days to get it completed. So if it's initial, you now have 60 more days. So now we're talking at least November, December, before we're going to come back and even review those evaluations. If it's a re-evaluation, we've done the evaluation and we still think there are things going on, they have 90 days to complete it. So now we're talking about we're in January. So once we go in, we determine what evaluations need to be done, we then order those evaluations, which means each person determines, yep, I think we need that evaluation. They will make that determination, they will set it up, and they will then tell us, we're going to come back in 60 or 90 days to review. I always love when they say, well, we'll try to get it done faster if it's okay with you if we don't give it to you within 5 days prior to the meeting. Well, sometimes I will say to families, no problem, just get it done so we can get moving because the child's really struggling. A lot of times I'll say, well, we're going to have to wait because we're going to need that information. Okay, so once now we've done those evaluations, we have to come back to the team and we do evaluation results. What happens is that every person who actually did the evaluation should be in that team. They should be able to review their findings with the entire group. If that person is no longer with the school system or they're out on maternity leave or whatever, they can have another professional as long as it's the same type. So if they did speech and language evaluation and she's out or she's sick or whatever, another speech and language professional has to come in and review that evaluation. Once we go through all of those evaluations, the meeting ends because, well, I shouldn't say that. First, we have to determine, was in fact this was it in fact a disability that we have found? If they say, yes, there is a disability, and yes, the child is eligible for an IEP, that's that review of evaluations and determination meeting. Once that's determined, they now have 30 days to write an IEP. So remember, we're already January or February, and now we're into March where we're actually writing the IEP. This first week of school is when you first came in, right? That's when you asked for these evaluations. Now we're in March, and we're talking about, okay, here's the results of these evaluations. We're going to write an IEP. We have 30 days to do that. Once we write that IEP, yay, big celebration, right? So, time to celebrate. Not quite. Because once we have that, they have 30 days to implement it. So now we're in April or May, implementing something that we asked for in September. So when families will say, oh, I just kind of want to wait to see how things go, I usually run through this. Okay, so you have this. That'll take us to May. If we wait one more month, we'll be in June, and school will be over. So that usually encourages them to say, better ask for that meeting so we can get this started. Once it's in place and we are celebrating, yay, we got an IEP, yay, my kid's going to do so well, we must follow up because the IEP is what we're aiming to obtain, but it is not worth anything but the paper it's written on if they don't implement it. And unfortunately, that happens more often than I would like to say. So, follow up with the family is a must. We have to assure that everything lines up properly. Everyone must understand what they need to do. And guess what? Everyone needs to stay in their lane and do their job. Everyone. So if we then say, okay, this is what we need to do, and they don't do it, we're on them saying, well, speech and language isn't meeting with them. I just had one the other day. The family says, well, we haven't had any speech and language all day. Family that called in yesterday several hundred times to say, I need to talk to her. That was it was about, because they haven't been getting their speech and language services all year. So when I contact the school, what the heck is going on? They said, nice and early this morning, we don't have a speech and language pathologist. So I said, that's not our problem. That is your problem. So either you need to pay for this family to take the child to speech and language outside of the school system, or you need to hire an outside person to come in and provide speech and language to all of those kids, because obviously my child is not the only one who's not receiving the speech and language services because they have no speech and language pathologist in the school. So I will be calling later today the Board of Education to say, guys, we are sending, in fact, I sent the correspondence to the parents to actually write a state complaint, because a lot of times that's where you get attention. So we have to make sure that everybody's doing their job, everyone's staying in their lane, and providing everything that the child needs. So what's the real ending? The real celebration comes at this point. So when a child is finally able to get through all levels of education that they want to be through, so that can be high school, it can be college, it can be graduate school. I have been told on many occasions, I have kids that they're never going to get a diploma. And guess what? One of my kids is in a PhD program in Florida now. But at second grade, he was never going to get a diploma. Now he's going to be telling the weather from a helicopter, because that's what he wanted to do. And we have many cases where that is actually the case. So when do we celebrate? I go to more graduations in June than you could ever imagine, because families will call and say, we did it. We actually got through all of this, and now my child is graduating. So that is the very quick down and dirty of IEP process, I.D.E.A., and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to call me, come in my office, talk to Keisha, talk to Jenna, talk to Joyce, who hears it all the time too, that I'm sure if they don't know the answer, they'll know where to find it from the resource queen as well. Okay, thank you.
What's the step down from an IEP? Is it a
504 plan?
504? What is that?
So a 504, so good question, is actually a part of Americans with Disability Act. And you're way too young to remember this, but in about 1976, all of a sudden there was this deinstitutionalization where people were moved out of institutions, they were moved out of all places, and you started seeing ramps going into everything, access for disabilities and disabled people everywhere. We have ramps here, we have ways of getting. So that all came about from the Americans with Disability Act. In that act, there is a section that's called 504. 504 says that we must make everything in our environment accessible to people with disabilities so that they are on an equal playing field with people without disabilities. Finally, in about 1985, they thought, that could also pertain to the school. So if a child has a disability but does not really require an IEP, we can provide them with accommodations that may also help them to access their education. So the 504 plan came into being. So we would have a meeting, same kind of thing, have this meeting to determine, does he have a disability? Is it impacting their education? But does he need direct instruction? If we say no to that third one, then he does not qualify for an IEP, but he would qualify for a 504 plan. So the 504 can be things like extra time, additional reading assistance, or having it read to them. It's many things, anything that that child needs just to access their education that is above and beyond what they would give to any child in the classroom.
Okay.
So yeah, it's kind of a step down, but it's actually a different law too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
So
Guess I should go back up here.
are there
any times where, with the IEPs, where you're ordering things, is there ever any expedited, like if you need something because as you described, it's taking all year?
Yeah,
Is there
unfortunately,
anything where it can be expedited and things?
well, we beg for that
Yeah.
on a regular basis. Like, oh, can't we get, I mean, this child is failing. I have kids who are self-harming because they're in a school that they just don't understand and they don't want to be there, or they're refusing to go to school. So yes, we can ask for that. Unfortunately, they will always fall back on the law. Like, we don't have a person to do it. We have 5 others lined up for these evaluations. Many times you can kind of say to the school, as I said before, look, we'll waive the 5 days, we'll waive any part of this that we can. They have to give us 10 days written notification of any meeting. If I'm available, have the meeting tomorrow. So there are things that we can try to adjust to make sure that they're able to get the services faster, but it is in the law. The big one that is really difficult for me is a family who is requesting an aid, and the school finally agrees this child needs an aid. In the law, it actually says they must obtain that aid as soon as possible. Well, that could be next year. And in some cases now where they're having trouble identifying and hiring, it is, a child will go almost a whole year without that aid. And all the school has to do is to prove that they are actually looking for someone for that position. I have one school in Baltimore County. There are 8 aides that are being sought after by one school. So trying to find the people. So typically what I will say to the family in that case, if you know someone that you think would be a great aid for your child, ask them if they will apply, and then send all the information. Tell that person that they specifically want to work with your child. And sometimes that will work. But we can't force the schools to do something that actually no one can do. We can't find people. So, and yeah, we try. I mean, and the families try, and the schools try in getting some of these done faster. And sometimes it's impossible. That's why you don't wait. I don't want to wait. If family says, well, I just want to wait to see how it goes for the next month. Nope. Ask for the IEP meeting. We'll determine how it goes when we've already got the meeting on the books. So, okay? Yes?
Is there ever a situation where you might have an IEP in place and then it goes away? Like you've graduated from your IEP?
Yes.
Or downgrades to the 504?
Yes.
Okay.
So it could be that a child has specific things that they have to meet. Many times they will meet those goals and objectives, and they've caught up.
Okay.
Doesn't happen a lot, but it happens. And then, but the school must prove that there are no continued needs. So they have to do evaluations. So let's just say you had a speech and language evaluation, had speech and language services, and now we feel like, oh, you know what? We're able to take that off the table because he's met those goals and we think he's up to speed with everywhere else. They have to do an evaluation to say, oh, you know what? There are no other areas that need to be addressed within speech and language. So they could go down to no IEP, or they could go to a 504, could even go to what's called a student support team, which is very similar to a 504. It's just informally done. Yeah. Anybody else?
I actually do have a question.
Okay.
So what are the statistics more so of a child that has an IEP going to an actual public school as opposed to cyber school and home? When they're in public school, they're failing, they have an IEP, they're pulled out, they do cyber school, they're not doing well, put them back in public school. I mean, is there any one over that's better than the other, or is it just basically?
Depends on the child.
And both accept the IEP.
Yes.
There's IEP, cyber school has IEP teachers,
Right.
But
Yeah, special educators, and it really is dependent upon the individual child. Some kids do better when they are in virtual classes and are able, so I have a few kids who have pretty significant emotional or anxiety needs. They do much better in a situation where it's all virtual as opposed to being in a classroom where they feel like they're being watched all the time. So if a child does it outside of school, I mean, they're in school and they're not doing well, and then moves to a virtual platform, still doesn't do well, you need to ask for another IEP meeting because that's why where we have to do the follow-up. Because if they're not progressing with that IEP, there needs to be something else done. They're not getting everything that they actually need. So we need to upgrade that IEP and figure out what other services they may need in order to be successful.
And what happens if they started virtual and they say, weren't doing well, and then they're switched over to the IEP program at virtual, and then they say, well, I don't like the IEP teachers, I like the other ones better. And do you see where this is going?
Yeah.
My grandson is in a particular situation. And
So it's a hard situation. I mean, it is. We can figure out, or we could try to figure out, why is it he does not like the special education teachers, or because there could be things, as I pointed out before, they feel different. It's a whole different group of people. I don't really fit into that. I mean, the hardest ones are the kids who are very bright, but also have special education needs, because they can figure it out. It's like, what? I should be able to do that, just like everybody else. Why can't I do that? Which makes them feel bad. So when they see that they're now with special educators, and it's like, why do I need this? I should be able to do that. It's very hard on them if they feel like they should be able to do what everybody else does.
another meeting.
Yes.
I was going to say, this feels silly to ask, but because of the PTOT speech component, who orders these things? Is there a medical component to it at all?
Can be.
Physician?
It can be.
Ordering?
So what really happens is, let's say that the child is seen outside of the school. They have physical needs, they have fine motor needs. The parent can take information from an outside source and say, hey, these are the services that this OT is saying that we need, or this physical therapist is saying that we need. There's such a thing as a medical model and an education model. So they would immediately say, oh, well, those recommendations we don't think we need, because they're actually able to do what we need them to do in the class. Great example, physical is an awesome way of understanding that. I have a child who's in a wheelchair. I go to the physical therapist. The physical therapist says, if he receives physical therapy every day for an hour, he'll be able to walk on his own. So we take that information to the school, and the school says, well, he doesn't need to walk to get to his classes. We can take him by the wheelchair. So we will not give them physical therapy because he can still access his education without having that physical therapy. So those are the kinds of things that you run into all the time.
My own personal experience, the school doesn't have stairs. So he has a physical therapist, but they won't work on stairs because he doesn't need to access any stairs in their school.
Or there's a minute amount, and I was just telling this story. I had a child 20 years ago that the family came to me and said, my child, there are only 4 steps in the school. So the physical therapist, his personal physical therapist, is saying they need to work on walking up and down those stairs. And they said, no. And the parent said, she has to go up and down those stairs in order to get to any class. They said, we can take them around outside the building and bring them in. I was like, this is ridiculous. Suppose it's snowing, suppose it's raining, suppose it's anything. work on those 4 stairs up and down. Oh, we can carry them. Please, this is crazy. We finally got them to agree to give her the physical therapy. It took 3 months, and she was able to do the stairs without the physical therapist. And I found out from the family, because they called in for another situation, that child has now graduated, and guess what she does? She's a physical therapist. So hopefully she'll be able to get those services for other kids in the schools. So there are some success stories, even out of crazy things that happen. Yes?
So I know there's teacher shortages in the school systems since COVID. Has post-COVID, has your job been harder?
Yes. No question. I mean, so I can't worry about their shortages. I just have to go in and say, this is what this child needs. They have to become creative, and they are becoming more creative of how they're going to do things. Just like I said with assistants, aides, they're hard to find. One school needing 8 aides, these are kids who are going without that. So we have to become a little bit more creative in how we do things. So teachers are having to do things differently. They're hiring people who are not certified as teachers because they have to have people in the classroom doing these things. So yes, I mean, it's hard, but I will still fight for what the child needs. That's our job, and that's what the parent is saying. We just need to have it on paper what they need, because if that child moves to a school district that actually has people, and they get an IEP that we left that off because, oh, we didn't have people to cover it, then they don't get it there either. And then we start the fight all over again. So we don't want to do that. So yeah, it's hard, and they do become creative. And unfortunately, a lot of these are ending up in the state. So they have a whole new department in the state who receives these complaints with a person, she's actually an attorney who I know, and I now call her, it's like, really, Allison, we've got to do something, because this child needs these services, so we have to come up with a creative way of getting it. And she can approve things like sending them to a private therapist, or having a private therapist come in and service several children in that school 1 day a week. So they're coming up with creative ways, and we're gonna continue to do that, because that shortage is most likely not going to go away overnight. So, okay, very good. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Thank you.